Figurative language. Metaphor has three parts, basically: the figure, the object to which the figure is transferred, and the relationship between them. Metaphorical theory involving these three elements remained pretty much at the level of Aristotle's Poetics until the 20th century. It's undergone significant development during the past decades. By 1936, I.A. Richards devised an interaction theory to explain the third element of the metaphor, the relationship between them. Instead of mere comparison, as Aristotle, Richards said, when we use a metaphor, and some of these observations these guys are coming up with are true. They have some really interesting insights. The problem is the overall philosophy is wrong. Richards said, when we use a metaphor, we have two thoughts of different things active together, whose meaning is the resultant of their interaction. Figurative language challenges the mind to reconcile a conflict. Anybody knows Proverbs? Proverbs is set that way. It challenges the mind to reconcile the conflict brought about by this juxtaposition of two disparate thoughts. One of its functions, then, is to trigger deeper thought. This is the function that has provoked much of the recent work. The recognized scope of figurative language has expanded in the last 50, 60 years. Early on, it was recognized that language is filled with dead metaphors, no longer recognized as such. One linguistic comment was that every language on earth is a cemetery of dead metaphors. And what they mean is things like leg of a table, hood of a car. At one time, those were new metaphors, but they've become so commonplace we all use them, we never think that we're speaking metaphorically. Now, there's no legs on a table. There's four things that hang down that are analogous to legs. There's no hood on the car, but we don't even see these as metaphors anymore. We don't have a problem with that. Also recognize the ubiquitous metaphor implied by the poets, and this is important because a lot of the prophetic literature is written in poetic form, for explanation, emotional impact, and aesthetic dressing. The kind of metaphor, however, that has stimulated the most research is the metaphor necessary to express abstractions and other ideas that cannot be directly experienced. Now here we get into the ice, the thin ice area. Notice the language. Express abstractions and other ideas that cannot be directly experienced. Richards writes, language well used does what the intuition of the senses cannot do. Words are the occasion and the means of that which is the mind's endless endeavor to order itself. Some think that the sensory image fills in the meaning of the word. It's rather the opposite. The word which brings in the meaning which the image and its original perception lack. And I think anybody who's spoken, any time you've written anything, haven't you had the experience of when you speak, all of a sudden something gels with you? Or when you write and you try to put it into words, oh yeah, now I see. So that's what they're getting at, that when you try to express in language thoughts, you get creative thinking. Well, these guys extended it far too far, and what it wounded up in this last part of the paragraph, Philip Wheelwright has gone further in saying of metaphor, it partly creates and partly discloses certain hitherto unknown, unguessed aspects of what is. See how this follows from Kant? If everything is just going on in your mind, if you play in your mind with metaphors, gee, you might come up with a new truth. That's what they're getting at. Needless to say, 20th century poets were quick to see the logical conclusion of language theory, so Wheelwright describes how they created pure poetry by composing nonsensical word combinations like toasted Susie is my ice cream, hoping that in the broad ontological fact that new qualities and new meanings would just emerge out of some hitherto ungrouped combination of elements. As in nature, and this is their quote, new qualities may be engendered by the coming together of elements. Just like neo-Darwinism, just like an evolutionary view of the cosmos. You play around, all of a sudden, gee, we got life here. Well, their idea is that that's what's going on in our minds with words. So let's look at the generation of meaning and its communication. Here we're getting closer to the problem. Note in the above ideas of language theory that man somehow spontaneously generates meaning like random evolutionary processes. How is this distinguishable from Kantian epistemology? Meaning springs up spontaneously in the subjectivity of man. Ostensible evangelicals like John Franke at Biblical Seminary have imbibed the same Kantian type of epistemology that comes hidden inside the so-called speech-act theory of recent language philosophy. Franke notes that language is not basically descriptive. Notice this. Language is not basically descriptive, but is constructive. And this construction occurs in the context of a linguistic community. To see why Frankie and others say this, and there's some aspects of truth to this, we need to remember that literal and figurative language depends on the use of symbols, as well as whole metaphors that carry information from a sender, a writer or a speaker, to the receiver, a reader or a listener. To successfully convey information, therefore, such symbols and metaphors must have the same meaning attributed to them by sender and receiver. That's easy to see. We believe that. Language theory, however, adds two further propositions. One, the assignment of meaning is purely an arbitrary act of the community of senders and receivers, the so-called sociolinguistic community. And two, all knowledge of such a community, that is what they see inside the community, it's limited to their situational perspective. Now this comes to bear on interpreting Scripture, as you'll see in a little bit. If one accepts both of these claims, then one's hermeneutic becomes very, very tentative. Where to draw the line between literal and figurative is made much more difficult, since whatever information is contained in a particular text can only have arisen inside the immediate community of the author in a purely arbitrary fashion. Since we exegetes are not part of the community, we face the daunting task of having to guess the nature of the arbitrary interaction of the metaphoric symbol and object. The second claim adds an additional complication. How much of the text expresses truths valid for us who don't even live in the community? Franke, for example, by accepting the propositions of modern language theory, finds himself unable to establish the Christian faith by exegesis alone. That's one of the conclusions you have to come to. Romans 10:17 says faith comes by what? And hearing by the, but not according to Franke. Figurative language and special revelation. In discussing how to identify figures and metaphoric expressions in prophetic literature, Sandy rightly notes that most of the prophetic literature is poetic and loaded with figurative language. He suggests many fine guidelines to interpret prophetic and apocalyptic literature by trying to understand the original intent of the author within his community. He wishes to avoid sensationalism that dogmatically assumes it knows in advance how each textual detail will be fulfilled. And then I gave you a little diagram to show you what he's getting at. A lot of that is okay. But when you go on further and read, here's where we get a problem. How do we enter into the linguistic community of the author? I read things like the following statements. These are the ones that sort of jumped out at me as I started reading this book. Language originates in humankind's fundamental need to communicate. This ought to strike you as a little uneasy. God's choices of a language were limited. The other issues God faced was how to describe heavenly concepts in human language. In a sense, prophecy was assigned an impossible task. With language limited to what we have experienced, how can God be described? Under divine empowerment, the prophets created metaphors and similes as best they could. In the language of curses and blessings of the Old Testament law code, actually originated in ancient Near Eastern culture. Our interpretation of Joel 2:31, many conclude that the meaning of the metaphor is unrelated to the normal meanings of the parts. The moon shall be turned to blood designates a time of upheaval, not necessarily any changes in the sky. It is likely that the celestial horrors of Revelation, and he quotes a series of texts, are metaphoric. Everything will be topsy-turvy. And one way to suggest that is to describe the heavens as completely disoriented. See where this goes? See, there's some serious questions here. In a work referenced in Plowshares and Pruning Hooks, Richard Patterson illustrates how texts, eschatological and non-eschatological, depicting geophysical catastrophes are to be interpreted figuratively. While he provides a convincing argument that the cosmic language of the Exodus furnished a natural development into the more spectacular, universal, and often ethereal tone that gave impetus to an emerging apocalyptic in the prophets of the pre-exilic and exilic periods, he explains the originating Exodus events as ordinary kinds that fit within a placid uniformitarian view of nature. These rather ordinary environmental happenings are remembered, however, with metaphorical language that is eventually enlarged to universality and end time. The Exodus imagery becomes an ancient myth of deliverance that provide the impetus for Yahweh warrior theology. And then you see a quote there where, again, it's talking about the taking this mundane event and glorifying it with these metaphors. While I have little argument with the admonition to be alert for figurative language and prophetic poetry and respect many of the practical rules Sandy has developed, I am uneasy with the freewheeling use of figurative language to minimize every hint of catastrophic phenomena in Scripture. In post-Kantian era, I wonder about the validity of a theology involving God as universal judge and savior that at the same time so depends upon Hebrew imagination that makes mountains out of molehills. Has something been smuggled in here from theories of how language works inside a linguistic community such that communication into and out of that community is so very limited? Didn't the God of special revelation design language and the world of perception to have adequate capacity for transferring his thoughts to man? There's another problem with minimizing the dimensions of biblical events. And what I'm getting at in this paragraph, folks, is that it's not just an exegetical problem of trying to figure out, gee, is this metaphorical or is this literal? But now we've got another theological problem. There's a whole area of theology that has to be dumped off to the side once you start playing games with these cosmic catastrophe judgments. Watch this. Only the most casual reader of the Bible could miss what Fredheim calls the symbiosis between the human and the non-human orders commonly observed in Old Testament from Genesis 3 on. In a day of heightened ecological awareness, how can we not take seriously the relationship between man as Lord of creation and the natural environment? From Genesis to Revelation, there is a constant, consistent theme: as goes man, so goes the environment. The greatest ecological disaster was a consequence of man's fall. That you won't find in the green publications. But think about it. If we're going to be serious about the Genesis text, what is the greatest ecological disaster? It's not Al Gore. It's Genesis 3. The greatest ecological disaster was a consequence of man's fall. The greatest ecological deliverance so far in history was what? Was Noah's role in salvaging the DNA that made possible the survival of all current air-breathing creatures. The first mentioned covenant in Genesis 9 is with animals as well as with man. The cursings and blessings of the Mosaic covenant, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, include environmental details as well as sociopolitical details. When the Son of Man returns and finally judges and blesses, why should we consider it unprecedented for there to be environmental consequences? So let me summarize what we've done here in this section. We talked about the cosmology, we talked about the epistemology, we looked a little bit now at what modern language theory is doing. So this is a summary of this second part. Third part. If liberal theologians uncritically absorbed the high claims of modern scientific cosmology and were seduced by the epistemology of Kant, have some evangelicals similarly imported a Trojan horse of modern language theory into the camp? Now watch the circular reasoning here. This is where you're trapped, and you have to make a decision one way or the other how you're going to handle the early chapters of Genesis. To formulate hermeneutical rules for interpreting texts of end-time geophysical catastrophes, one must exercise a special care in understanding the Exodus and subsequent events. But to do that, one has to understand what the early chapters of Genesis are saying about man and his physical environment. But you can't do that if he or she has already been convinced that Genesis and Exodus are only Hebrew religious autobiography. And one cannot break out of the supposed limits of the Hebrew community's language without relying upon the supernatural origin and design of language early in Genesis. Indeed, it seems like the dog is chasing his tail, to use a metaphor. Without a better view of language than that afforded by recent secular theories that are largely based on Darwinian and Kantian epistemology, interpreters appear to be left with language too limited to carry the full throughput of special revelation. As above, the example above this guy's just shown how following the minimalist interpretation of cosmic imagery truncates the theology of man-nature symbiotic relationship.